The sun lifted itself over Fort Bramblegate's marksmanship yard, stretching long, sharp shadows across the firing lanes, while the early air carried the faint metallic smell of spent brass. Lieutenant Mira Calhoun made her way toward a line of male soldiers getting ready for their long-range drills, her steps quiet and steady, almost blending into the gravel until Sergeant First Class Logan Hale finally noticed her. His smirk showed up before he even spoke. When she calmly told him she wanted to run the sniper qualification lane, quick, careless laughter burst out from the group. Hale shook his head and called her optics weight, telling her she should stay in admin before she embarrassed herself. Two corporals leaned toward each other and whispered that she didn't even look like someone who belonged behind a rifle, their low voices soaked in confidence they hadn't earned. Mira didn't flinch. She stayed rooted in place, letting the disrespect settle over her like dust in the morning breeze, refusing to give their mockery any shape at all. Their last scraps of laughter drifted downrange, thin and meaningless. Before we get into the story, make sure you subscribe to Major Tom's Tales so you never miss these true military stories, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from today. Lieutenant Mira Calhoun wasn't the kind of person most people expected to quiet down a whole firing line. She was small-framed, narrow-shouldered, with calm, analytical eyes that missed very little and revealed even less. Most days, troops passed her in Fort Bramblegate's hallways with polite nods, already forgetting her by the time they reached the next door. Her job didn't help their assumptions either. On paper, she was a forward observer working in the battalion fire cell, one of those officers people associated with map overlays, grid corrections, and call for fire paperwork instead of dust, recoil, or steel plates ringing at distance. She was the one they paged for coordinate checks, not the person they imagined as a shooter worth remembering. That reputation wrapped around her like an invisible cloak. Still, whenever training days rolled around, Mira always drifted toward the firing lines earlier than she had to. While others joked or scrolled their phones, she watched the early shots downrange with quiet focus, the slight dip of a barrel before a trigger broke, the way a shooter's breath lifted too high in their chest, the tiny hints of impatience that made a muzzle wander off target. She stood with her hands tucked behind her back, quietly studying patterns no one imagined she was paying attention to. Most of the soldiers only saw a soft-spoken lieutenant who signed range cards and tracked ammo counts without complaint. None of them noticed how her eyes automatically flicked to the shimmer of mirage above the dirt, or how she checked the hanging flags to match the wind with what she felt brushing her skin. When a round struck, high or low, her gaze shifted almost imperceptibly, as if she were updating a dope chart only she could see. Around the unit, her reputation stayed simple: quiet, polite, always early. She slipped into briefings before anyone else, claimed the same seat every time, and didn't leave until the last slide disappeared. She never interrupted, never talked over a soul. She listened, took notes, and faded out of view before the coffee even cooled. That was enough for most people to assume they had her figured out. Some enlisted guys joked that she was the paperwork lieutenant. Good for fixing grid mistakes, but not much else. They didn't mean it cruelly, at least not in the beginning. It came from the casual confidence of people who never bothered to question the stories they built about someone. A few thought they were being helpful when they said she should stay far from the line of fire. Only a handful ever noticed she almost never rolled up her sleeves, even when the heat pressed hard against the range. On her left forearm beneath the fabric, a faint shape would sometimes ghost through when the sun hit just right. It could have been anything. A small design, a simple line of ink, but nobody ever saw the whole thing. Her sleeve always covered it before curiosity had the chance to grow. Sergeant First Class Logan Hale was the opposite of Mira in nearly every obvious way. broad through the chest, walking with the kind of swagger scraped together from multiple combat tours, and a voice loud enough to cut across a range without a microphone. Years of teaching had made his ego just as sharp as his marksmanship. His men respected him, but they also learned fast to laugh at his jokes if they wanted to stay on the right side of his temper. Hale swore he could judge shooters at a glance. He claimed he could tell from a soldier's grip and shoulders whether they'd survive the first real contact. He loved pointing out range commandos who looked the part, but couldn't hold a grouping to save their lives. To him, Mira was just another officer made for map boards, not scopes. Corporal Nolan Fry hovered near Hale like a predictable sidekick. He always carried a grin, tossed out quick comments, and repeated whatever punchline he sensed would get the sergeant laughing. Nolan wasn't naturally cruel, but his need to belong to the loudest voice pushed him toward mockery faster than he would have chosen on his own. It was easier to echo someone else than risk being the joke. Then there was Staff Sergeant Reed Marston, who rarely laughed when others did. Reed stayed quieter, keeping a small distance from the group, arms folded, eyes narrowed against the glare and his own thoughts. He'd seen enough over the years. Dusty valley firefights, nights that smelled like cordite and fear, to know that confidence and competence weren't always twins. When Mira stepped onto the range, he didn't smirk. He simply watched. Mira felt all their eyes following her as she walked across the gravel toward the benches, though she kept her expression calm and her pace unhurried. She'd learned long ago that people filled silence with whatever made them comfortable. Naivety, weakness, innocence. Let them. None of it changed who she was or what her hands had done. In the quiet moments when the range emptied and the sky over Fort Bramblegate faded into soft purple, Mira often found her thoughts slipping back to places no one here had seen. Wide, open land where wind dragged across endless fields. Days in the redwood plains where she had stood beside her father on a ridge, resting the rifle on a worn pack as the world narrowed into a single breath and a single target. He taught her early that rifles didn't forgive arrogance and the wind didn't care about rank. He showed her how grass flattened in long invisible waves, how dust rose off a distant trail before a truck showed itself, how the air shifted when a storm was still hours away. Wind, terrain, patience, the same 3 words repeated over and over until they stopped being lessons and turned into the way she understood the world. Those memories lived just beneath her steady expression. No one on base asked about the redwood plains, and she never volunteered stories. It was easier that way. Years ago, she chose to keep certain parts of her past locked away, not out of shame, but because she knew how quickly people could twist someone's history into a campfire tale they didn't earn. There were nights, distances, and decisions she refused to let be turned into cheap conversation. She refused to let her past become something cheap enough for people to gossip over, and that choice weighed on her more than she ever admitted. Every time she watched someone struggle with a shot she could fix in seconds, or listened to a soldier brag about a range day that would have barely counted as a warm-up where she had once trained, she felt the strain of that silence dig in. It was like carrying a heavy pack only she knew existed. Even so, she kept her sleeves rolled down, kept her voice steady, signed paperwork, checked grids, and explained angles and corrections as if everything she knew had come from a classroom instead of real-world experience. If anyone noticed how naturally her explanations flowed, no one said a word. Now, standing on the gravel with Hale and his men staring at her like she was some oddity, Mira felt that old choice settle in her chest again. She could turn around, keep her past tucked away, and let their version of her go unchallenged, Or she could finally ask for something she had earned long before any of them ever heard her name. She drew in a slow breath, feeling the fabric brush the ink hidden on her arm. The familiar weight of everything she'd done but never spoken about. Her eyes met Hale's. Not defiant, not pleading, just steady, the way a shooter settles behind a scope. "Sergeant Hale," she said evenly, her voice cutting clean through the morning air. "I am requesting permission to run the sniper qualification lane." Sergeant First Class Logan Hale stepped in close, gravel snapping under his boots as he blocked her path to the bench. His shadow stretched across her toes, heavy and deliberate. He looked her over with disbelief edging into irritation. Then he leaned in, speaking low enough to make it personal, but loud enough to make sure his audience caught every word. Sniper work was for fighters, he said, not for someone who lived behind paperwork. He expected the insult to shut her down. Instead, soldiers drifted nearer, drawn by the tension like moths to a flame. A loose semicircle formed, arms crossed, smirks spreading as Hale's disrespect gave everyone permission to treat her like a joke. Corporal Nolan Fry took an exaggerated deep breath, puffing out his chest and whispering, "Steady breathing," in a fake meditation voice. Laughter snapped through the group, sharp, fast, eager, like everyone wanted to prove they were part of the same joke. Mira didn't budge. She didn't retreat or let her shoulders sink. She kept her hands folded neatly behind her back, posture straight, eyes calm. The sun warmed her uniform while the space between her and the crowd grew colder, heavy with everything unspoken. She looked like someone choosing restraint over ego, discipline over noise. And moments like that always make you wonder, what would you have done? Would you have held your tongue, taking the hit without reacting? Or would something inside you have cracked? Would you have walked off? Or stood your ground? Hale clearly assumed she'd drop her gaze and leave. He barked an order for her to get off the range immediately, adding that wasting the cadre's time was a great way to make enemies in the unit. His tone softened only slightly, just enough to hide the sharp edge beneath it. Mira still didn't move. Her stillness made a few soldiers shift uncomfortably, suddenly unsure who actually held control of the moment. Hale's jaw flexed, irritation creeping through. When she didn't back off, he stepped even closer, trying to reclaim the authority slipping from his grip. More infantry soldiers wandered over, helmets in hand, pulled by the raised voices. They formed a second ring behind the first, hungry for drama. Someone muttered she'd never shot past 300 yards. Another whispered he'd bet a week's pay she wouldn't even touch the rifle. The comments drifted through the crowd like thin smoke, carried by people who had already judged her without knowing a single truth about her. Mira let their whispers slide past without reaction. Her eyes stayed on Hale, steady and unwavering. She didn't speak until the murmurs finally died down, and the entire group stared at her like a show about to start. Only then did she say, "Just give me one lane." Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise cleanly enough to pull silence behind it. Hale stared at her for a beat, then another, before breaking into loud, dismissive laughter, forced, almost desperate, as if he needed everyone to remember he still controlled the joke. But something subtle shifted around them. Not everyone joined him this time. A few soldiers exchanged uneasy looks. One infantryman lowered his arms, frowning. Another pressed his lips together, as if suddenly realizing the joke wasn't funny anymore. Reed Marston, standing behind the others, watched the moment with a tightening jaw, his eyes locked on Mira instead of Hale. She didn't react to the mocking. Instead, she stepped past Hale, her boots crunching on the gravel with a quiet finality. She walked toward the shooting bench with deliberate calm. the crowd parting just enough to let her through. The rifle lay across the wooden platform, matte black metal catching slivers of morning light, the scope glinting softly. She rested her hand on the stock, gently, almost reverently. That single movement sent a ripple through the onlookers. Nolan Fry's grin faltered. A couple of soldiers exchanged confused glances. Reed's eyes narrowed with sharp recognition. The way she handled the rifle had nothing to do with luck or curiosity. It was practiced, learned. Hale reacted fast, thrusting his hand forward to stop her before he lost control of the moment. His fingers hovered inches from her wrist, and the crowd held its breath, unsure what was coming next. The air tightened, as if the whole range inhaled and forgot to exhale. Even the breeze that had carried their mockery seemed to pause, waiting. Every eye locked onto the two of them. Mira standing poised, Hale reaching out, the rifle between them like a line dividing who they assumed she was from who she might truly be. And for the first time that morning, not a single laugh broke the silence. As Mira shifted her grip and tugged her sleeve just enough to free her wrist, a thin strip of ink flashed beneath the fabric. Only half a circle of crosshairs, a sliver of numbers. Nothing decorative, nothing accidental, but it was enough to catch Reed Marston's eye. His expression changed instantly, the faint lines around his mouth tightening as something long buried flickered behind his gaze. He'd seen marks like that before, usually on people who'd spent long nights in hostile valleys, people who'd taken shots no one ever bragged about. Hale didn't notice or didn't care. He kept talking sharply, trying to drag the moment back under his control. He waved her off with the same dismissive arrogance he'd had from the start, unaware the mood had already shifted underneath him. No one laughed now. The men watched with a quiet that felt tense, uneasy. Mira lifted the rifle like it belonged in her hands. Her stance settled naturally, shoulders relaxed, elbows forming a steady triangle, her weight shifting so subtly it looked effortless. Beginners fidgeted. Beginners hesitated. Mira moved like someone returning to muscle, memory forged long before Fort Bramblegate ever knew her name. Her breathing slowed, deliberate and trained, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of someone who understood that a good shot begins long before the trigger breaks. The wind shifted across the range, carrying dust and the faint sting of cordite. Mira closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. Too quick to be nerves, too intentional to be doubt. Reed recognized the motion instantly, the quiet ritual of experienced long gunners reading the air by instinct instead of instruments. A small exhale left her lips, like confirming a calculation only she could see. Another detail surfaced as she adjusted her grip, a faint pale scar above her wrist. Clean, surgical, the kind of mark that comes from treatment far from any comfortable hospital, on nights where decisions were made fast. Reed saw that too. He took a slow breath, arms folded, no longer pretending he wasn't watching closely. A captain walking by slowed mid-stride, his eyes dropping to Mira's posture. Something in her stance made him halt completely. He wasn't close enough to hear a word, but recognition flickered across his face anyway, lingering long enough for the soldiers nearby to notice before he finally walked on, glancing back one more time. A flicker of recognition mixed with surprise crossed the passing captain's face. He lingered long enough for nearby soldiers to exchange puzzled looks, then finally kept walking, though he glanced back one last time before disappearing behind the control shack. Quiet whispers started leaking through the crowd like thin cracks in a wall. Where'd she learn that grip? I've only seen shooters do that after deployment. That's not beginner stuff. One infantryman leaned sideways, eyebrows knitting as he studied her hands. the way she angled the rifle, the unconscious tuck of her chin. Someone else muttered she looked way too calm for someone who'd never done this before, the words hanging in the air somewhere between doubt and respect. Mira didn't respond. Maybe she heard every comment. Maybe she didn't. Either way, she refused to let any of it matter. Her eyes stayed locked on the lane, studying distance markers, terrain dips, the faint shimmer of mirage rising from the dirt. Only someone who'd put in real hours behind a rifle read a range like that. She moved her foot back an inch, lowering her weight, adjusting her stance with a precision that made no sound at all. Hale finally sensed the shift around him. The smirks aimed at her were fading, melting into uncertainty. He straightened, clearing his throat as if trying to pull the moment back under his command. Then he jabbed a finger toward the lane with forced impatience. "Enough theatrics, Lieutenant," he snapped. "Get it over with." His voice cracked through the range. Sharp, brittle, meant to end the murmurs that were slipping out of his control. But the order only deepened the silence. Mira dropped, behind the rifle with practiced ease. No rush, no shaking hands, no sign she was out of her depth. Reed Marston's jaw tightened. Nolan Fry swallowed, his grin collapsing into something hollow. A couple soldiers stepped closer without meaning to, curiosity edging into tension. The air stretched tight again, the wind seeming to pause just like before. And for the first time, Mira wasn't the one who looked out of place. Everyone else did. She sank into the prone mat with a steadiness that made the gravel shift quietly beneath her. Every movement was smooth, deliberate, efficient, not a hint of wasted motion. Her elbows set firmly. Her spine aligned perfectly behind the barrel. Everything about her position looked instinctive rather than recently learned. She made tiny adjustments, rotating her shoulder a few degrees, shifting her cheek weld until the scope ringed cleanly, sliding her support hand forward just an inch to lock the position. These weren't the clumsy tweaks of an officer trying something new. These were the habits of someone who had done this more times than she'd ever mention. The men who'd laughed earlier weren't laughing now. Their smirks thinned into something like wary interest. Mira didn't spare them a glance. Her focus stayed on the lane ahead. The silhouette target set at a tough mid-range distance, the wind nudging unpredictably across the field. Then, without lifting her gaze from the scope, she asked, "Wind reading?" The question snuffed out the last pieces of laughter. Hale scoffed immediately, waving a dismissive hand. "Just shoot the rifle, Lieutenant. You're not writing a textbook." But before he could shut her down completely, someone else moved. Reed stepped half a pace forward, arms no longer crossed. His voice was steady, almost neutral, but there was an edge beneath it, a hint that he wanted confirmation of what he already suspected. 7 to 9 miles per hour, left to right, gusts up to 12, he said. Mira gave a tiny nod, no thanks, no glance, just a subtle shift in her breath, as if the numbers clicked effortlessly into a calculation she knew by heart. Her fingers settled onto the trigger. The shot cracked cleanly across the range, kicking dust from the steel plate as it struck just off center. Close, controlled. Not luck. Mira didn't celebrate. She didn't even lift her head. She adjusted 2 mils on the scope, shifted her right elbow, smoothed her breathing, and fired again. This round landed only inches from center, the sharp ring echoing with undeniable precision. The crowd fell silent. All smirks vanished. Hale's jaw tightened, frustration and disbelief mixing behind his eyes. Mira still didn't react. She studied the hit instead of the faces around her, made a tiny adjustment to her cheek weld, shifted her weight just slightly, inhaled, exhaled, and her third shot broke. This one smacked dead center. The crowd froze, as if the entire base had exhaled at the same time. Nolan Fry blinked rapidly, forcing out a weak laugh that fell flat. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, but his voice had lost its confidence. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was trying to convince himself the world still made sense. Hale stepped forward, talking louder than he needed to. "Try the 1,000-yard steal. Let's see if that luck holds." The challenge hung heavy in the air, clearly meant to expose her limits rather than test her skill. But Mira simply rose to her feet with calm, controlled precision, brushing dust from her hands. No excitement, no nerves, just the quiet composure of someone who'd stood behind a rifle under real pressure. Conditions these men had only experienced in clean, predictable lanes. She returned to the bench, lifted the rifle, and reset her stance. Her movements were unmistakable to Reed Marston. He'd trained alongside deployed snipers in places where the wind carried sand and fear in equal measure. He knew how experienced long-range shooters read the world around them. Mira moved exactly like they did, with a collected stillness learned from the understanding that correctness mattered long before speed. She didn't ask for a wind reading this time. Instead, she closed her eyes for a brief, centered breath, felt the air settle across her skin, watched the mirage shimmer above the barrel, and made 3 small adjustments. One to the bipod, one to the scope, one to the angle of her right foot pressing into the dirt. Then she fired. The bullet cut across the long open stretch of the range, slicing through shifting wind. It hit the distant steel with a flat, echoing clang, a perfect 1,000-yard shot. A quiet wave of disbelief rippled through the onlookers. Someone whispered, "No way." Another murmured, "She calculated drift on her own." The shift in the crowd spread outward, doubt softening into respect, mockery fading into the early edges of admiration. Even the infantry soldiers at the back stood a little straighter, brows furrowing as they replayed what they'd just witnessed. Mira rose slowly from the rifle, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged. She didn't search for praise. She didn't need it. She simply stepped back, wiping her palms again as if those shots were routines she'd carried out hundreds of times. Reed didn't hide his stare now. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on her sleeve, on the faint outline of a tattoo he'd glimpsed earlier, crosshairs, numbers, distances. He'd seen marks like that before, and only a handful of shooters ever earned them. None of those people had been beginners. His boots shifted on the gravel as suspicion turned into certainty. There was no way Mira Calhoun was who these soldiers thought she was. Not after shots like that. Not after the way she breathed, judged wind, calculated angles. He wasn't just watching a quiet lieutenant anymore. He was witnessing something far more seasoned, far more complex. Someone who had lived a life they didn't yet understand. And the real reveal was still coming. The metal door of the range officer's hut creaked open, and a hush rippled through the crowd even before the figure stepped outside. Boots struck concrete in a slow, measured rhythm. Then the man emerged into the sunlight, General Harris Lockwood himself, the one person on base whose presence could silence an entire battalion without raising his voice. Conversation died instantly. Shoulders straightened. Even Hale's throat bobbed in a nervous swallow. Whatever mockery lingered evaporated in the general's shadow. Lockwood didn't look at the crowd. His eyes fixated on Mira Calhoun. He'd been inside the office, watching her last series of shots through the narrow observation window. Now he approached with controlled, deliberate steps, the air growing heavier with each one. Soldiers parted for him instinctively, forming a wide arc that left Mira standing alone on the gravel as he closed the distance. When he stopped in front of her, his gaze didn't go to the rifle or the targets. It drifted to her left forearm, to the faint shape beneath the sleeve she had tugged earlier. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Lieutenant, may I see that tattoo?" Every breath in the crowd paused. Even the wind seemed to still, as if the entire base held itself waiting for her answer. Mira hesitated, not from fear, but from a deeper, older reluctance, like someone being asked to open a chapter she'd kept sealed for years. Slowly, her fingers lifted toward her sleeve. With careful, deliberate movements, she rolled her sleeve upward and revealed the ink completely. The tattoo wasn't decorative, and it definitely wasn't meant to be pretty. It was a record, etched with a sniper's scope lined in disciplined detail, wind notations curling along the sides, and 4 numerical distances placed with exact spacing. They weren't random numbers or artistic choices, they were precise. The kind of distances that told a story only a small handful of people in the world would ever recognize. General Harris Lockwood froze, his breath catching, not dramatically but with a quiet tension that hinted at old memories resurfacing in a flash. He knew those distances, knew them down to the exact yard. 140, 147, 983. And the last, over 1,300 yards. Those weren't tattoos for show. They were the exact engagement ranges from a classified joint operation in northeastern Afghanistan, one he had personally reviewed 6 years earlier. The reports came in piece by piece, mentioning only an unregistered long-range shooter who'd saved 2 trapped teams in a valley ambush. No name had been attached. Contractors rarely received credit, but now he was staring at the truth inked into her skin. His voice dropped into a deep, steady tone. "Where did you earn those?" Mira met his gaze, calm but carrying the weight of something older, something lived. When she answered, her voice barely rose above the breeze. "Afghanistan, before I commissioned." Another silence washed over the range, heavier than any mockery thrown at her earlier. Soldiers who had laughed minutes before now stood pinned in place, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock, then to something uncomfortably close to shame. Reed Marston exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing, not in doubt anymore, but in understanding. Hale's mouth hung open, his swagger collapsing as reality settled like dust at his boots. No one spoke, no one moved. Respect, real, earned, undeniable, began to spread through the firing line like a tide rolling backward. The woman they had dismissed wasn't who they thought she was. She had been someone long before Fort Bramblegate judged her. General Lockwood stepped back slowly, his eyes fixed on Mira's forearm. For a long moment he simply studied her, truly studied her, as if piecing together a story he should have recognized sooner. Then he dipped his chin in a slow, deliberate nod. Not protocol, not courtesy. A gesture of respect from one warrior to another. That single nod hit harder than any shouted command. Hale's face drained of color, his arrogance dissolving under the weight of what he'd done. His jaw clenched, not with anger, but with the cold shock of realizing he'd crossed a line he never even knew existed. Nolan Fry dropped his gaze to the gravel, shoulders collapsing inward. The jokes that had come so easily now hung in the air like poison, sour and heavy. Reed Marston, though, stood a little straighter. His spine lengthened, as if all the tiny clues he'd noticed earlier finally snapped into place. Her stance, her breathing, her instinctive adjustments. None of it had been coincidence. His expression softened, not with pity, but with quiet awe. General Lockwood finally turned toward the assembled soldiers. His boots shifted in the dust, and his gaze swept across them with a weight that made even confident men brace. "You laughed," he said, his voice low and cutting like a blade, "at someone who saved American lives at distances most shooters only read about." The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no shuffling boots, no whispers, just a stillness so deep it pressed against the lungs. Some younger soldiers looked away, cheeks burning. Others stared at Mira with wide, stunned eyes, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Hale opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Nolan Fry swallowed hard. A few infantrymen who had gathered just to watch the mockery now stood frozen, as guilt settled onto them too, even if they hadn't said a word. Mira didn't move. She stood just as quietly as she had at the start of the morning, hands steady, shoulders level. Her expression didn't shift. Calm, composed, no pride, no anger, no trace of triumph. Just that same quiet dignity that had carried her through their mockery only minutes earlier. General Harris Lockwood turned back towards her. "Lieutenant Calhoun," he said, his voice firm but respectful, "you are cleared to attempt the full sniper selection, effective immediately." It felt as if the entire range inhaled at once. A breathless moment stretched thin across everyone present. A turning point, the exact instant the atmosphere rearranged itself around a new truth. The men who had mocked her now stood on the edge of something unfamiliar. Respect she had never asked for but had fully earned. Mira's eyes flickered for the first time, a small steady breath easing from her chest. She didn't smile, she didn't break. She simply nodded, accepting the order as if it were any other. Yet the air around her felt changed, charged, humbled, transformed. Then, as if suddenly aware of the weight of his actions, Hale stepped forward. His boots dragged slightly, as though pulled down by pride and regret battling inside his chest. He hesitated, then raised his hand in a salute. It wavered for only a heartbeat before locking into place. Mira returned it instantly, clean and steady. No showmanship, no lingering, no gloating. She didn't hold it long. She honored the gesture, nothing more. And somehow, that simplicity struck harder than any speech could have. Hale lowered his salute with a stiff nod, unable to meet her gaze. Nolan Fry shifted awkwardly, hands clasped behind his back, wishing he could melt into the gravel. Reed Marston stepped aside, giving her space, not out of fear, but from genuine respect. Then something remarkable happened. The crowd parted on its own. Not because Lockwood barked an order, not because anyone told them to. They simply stepped back, creating an open path for her, a collective instinct acknowledging she had earned a place none of them had the right to block. Mira walked forward with calm, steady steps, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. Sunlight warmed her shoulders. Her sleeve rolled high enough to reveal the truth she no longer needed to hide. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Behind her, the silence she left wasn't the silence of mockery. It was the silence of deep, unshakable respect. The afternoon sun stretched low over Fort Bramblegate, casting warm light across the gravel, as Mira put distance between herself and the firing line. Her steps were quiet, measured, but far lighter than they had been that morning. The tension she'd carried for hours no longer clung to her shoulders. Behind her, the range slowly filled with chatter again, but none of it reached her. She walked alone toward the admin building, the late-day breeze brushing against her rolled sleeve, as if reminding her of what she had revealed and why she'd kept it hidden for so long. She didn't regret the silence she had lived inside. It wasn't born from shame. It came from nights beneath foreign skies, from lives that stayed intact because her hands had steadied a rifle when it mattered most. It came from the humility her father had instilled in her. the understanding that some things were meant to be carried quietly, not displayed. Some stories didn't belong in casual conversation. Some truths weren't meant to be traded for admiration or applause. They belonged in the spaces between breaths, in the moments when the world fell still. As she walked, she thought of the redwood plains, the wind rolling across empty ridges, her father's voice teaching her patience and purpose. She thought of the men and women she'd helped protect overseas, of the radio calls that never made it into official reports, of the distances etched into her skin because forgetting them had never been an option. Others saw numbers. She saw faces, split-second choices that had altered the course of someone's life. Her footsteps slowed when she sensed someone approaching from behind. Reed Marston caught up, not rushing her, not intruding, just matching her pace. He walked beside her for a few quiet seconds before speaking. "I hope I see you at selection," he said softly. "We need shooters who understand what silence costs." His words weren't heavy or demanding. They were simply an acknowledgement from someone who understood more than most men on that range ever would. Mira turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. There was no pride in her expression, no sense of triumph mixed into her gratitude, only a calm sincerity. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," she replied quietly. Reed nodded once, then peeled off, heading back toward the firing line and leaving her to finish her walk alone. The sun warmed the path ahead as she approached the admin building, its doors reflecting a soft, muted light. As she walked, a quiet truth settled deeper into her chest. Real strength rarely announces itself. Some warriors carry their past in silence, not for recognition, not for applause, but because the memories themselves demand a kind of respect. Mockery fades, skill stays. Mira reached the steps, placed her hand on the door, and pushed it open without a backward glance. Behind her, the distant buzz of the range shifted with new perspectives, but she didn't need to look back. She had already stepped beyond it. The narrator's tone softens as the story settles, letting the weight of Mira's journey linger gently in the listener's mind. Not every warrior moves through the world loudly, and not every hero carries visible medals. Some keep their strength quiet, shaped by moments they never speak about, choosing dignity over display. It's a reminder that extraordinary people often walk right beside us, their histories hidden, their sacrifices unspoken. Humility, discipline, and quiet resolve can stand just as tall as rank or reputation. And if Mira's story moved you, or reminded you of someone in your life who carries their past in silence, stay connected. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Major Tom's Tales for more military and veteran stories, keeping their courage alive for the generations that follow.